This video is brought to you by Imprint. Jamaica and the IMF have a difficult history. The island has spent most of its independent history under some sort of IMF programme, and after its 15th bailout in 2013, IMF officials would begin their meetings with a dark joke: has Jamaica crashed yet? Today, however, everything has changed. Jamaica has staged perhaps the most impressive fiscal recovery in modern history, with debt to GDP halving in a decade, and is now basically the IMF's favourite economy. So in this video, we're going to take a look at how Jamaica became a sort of Caribbean Germany, and what more general lessons there might be available. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. Before we get into it, we should say a lot of this video comes from a series led by Robin Wigglesworth over at the Financial Times' Alphaville blog, so go and check that out if you want to know more. Anyway, let's start with some context. For most of its independent history, Jamaica was in some sort of economic crisis. While there was some pretty solid growth in the first decade after independence in 1962, once the oil price shock hit in 1973, GDP growth and income stagnated, unemployment rose, and crime became endemic. Wealthier, educated Jamaicans started leaving the country in ever larger numbers, triggering a so-called brain drain and pushing Jamaica's economy into a downward spiral. Despite this, the government kept on borrowing, pushing Jamaica's debt to GDP ratio up to frankly silly levels. It often rose above 100% of GDP and peaked at 212% in 1984. This would be dangerously high for basically any economy, let alone one as poor as Jamaica, which had a GDP per capita of just over $1,000 at the time. Just servicing this debt, i.e. paying off the interest, often accounted for more than half of all the government's revenues, and it looked like Jamaica was stuck in a debt trap. Even though the government pursued a policy of massive austerity, they were unable to reduce the overall debt burden, because recurring interest payments just kept them pinned down. This meant that Jamaica was constantly going to the IMF for bailouts, even though many Jamaicans thought the austerity measures required to get access to IMF funding were both cruel and ineffective, evidenced by the fact that, well, Jamaica had to keep going back. Nonetheless, in the late 2000s, with its debt to GDP ratio rising, Jamaica went to the IMF once again. In February 2010, the IMF approved a $1.3 billion loan, and the programme started off surprisingly well, with the fund noting in its first review that every target had been hit and growth was better than expected. However, the Jamaican government's cack-handed attempt to extradite gang leader Christopher Dudas Coke brought everything crumbling down. Coke was Jamaica's most powerful don, who basically ran the neighbourhood of Tivoli in Kingston as his own personal fiefdom. Everyone in the neighbourhood called him president, and Jamaican police had to ask him permission to enter. When the US first requested his extradition on drug and firearms charges in 2009, Jamaica's then Prime Minister, Bruce Golding, who also represented Tivoli Gardens as an MP, tried to tell them that it was a bad idea, but the US insisted, in part because they suspected Coke was funding Golding's party. Coke then turned Tivoli into his own personal fortress, with barricades and armed sentries, and the ensuing shootout, where Jamaican security services used helicopters and fired mortars on a residential neighbourhood that still held thousands of civilians, was a bloodbath. Over 100 people, including a large number of civilians, were killed, and there were reports of extrajudicial assassinations by the security services. Politically weakened, Golding tried to bolster his popularity by increasing public spending, violating the terms of the IMF's agreement and pushing up Jamaica's debt to GDP. In late 2011, Golding was forced out anyway, and his centre-right Jamaica Labour Party government was beaten in a landslide by the more left-wing People's National Party, the other big party in Jamaican politics. With debt nearing 150% of GDP, the PNP immediately went to the IMF for yet another loan. The IMF were understandably hesitant. This would be Jamaica's 15th IMF loan, and the last one had collapsed barely a year in. But after a year of intense lobbying, in 2013, Jamaica finally received a $2 billion lifeline. Everyone thought the programme was doomed. It demanded crippling austerity in a country that had a long history of fiscal incontinence and was already running a primary surplus of around 5% of GDP. However, that's not quite how things turned out. Jamaica successfully made further cuts to government spending and regularly ran primary surpluses between 7 and 8% of GDP. Jamaica's debt-to-GDP ratio duly fell from 147% in 2013 to 72% in 2023, with further declines expected in the coming years. Unemployment and poverty have fallen to record lows, inflation has been tamed, and in 2020, Jamaica formally exited its IMF program. It's hard to overstate quite how incredible this is. Very few countries run surpluses, let alone ones representing 8% of GDP, and debt ratios are rising across basically the entire world. This austerity did limit growth to an average of about 0.75% a year, but that's risen to more like 2% today. So how did Jamaica pull this off, and are there any general lessons for other debt-addicted governments? Well, some of this is down to the usual stuff. Jamaica had some pretty strict fiscal rules, adherence to which was monitored by an independent body. The Jamaican experience is also another data point to suggest that anyone who wants to bring their debt-to-GDP ratio down should focus more on spending less rather than growing more. But the big lesson from Jamaica is the importance of cross-party consensus. In other words, this only worked because both the big parties in Jamaica, the JLP and the PNP, agreed it necessary to happen. The JLP actually took over from the PNP in 2016, but they stuck to the same fiscal rules and didn't weaponise the issue politically, like, say, David Cameron and George Osborne did in the UK. Cross-party consensus is necessary here, because without it, the other party would just use the newfound fiscal space for fun stuff, like tax cuts or more spending, which would make sustained surpluses impossible. This is sort of what's happened in the US. Neither party is even talking about the deficit, because they suspect the other one would just abuse any newfound fiscal space, which is what George W. Bush did with his tax cuts after Clinton's successive surpluses in the late 90s. Now, this cross-party consensus was made possible in Jamaica by some very specific political conditions, including the existence of a multilateral discussion forum called the Economic Programme Oversight Committee, which was set up years ago to deal with class divisions and political violence, and the fact that ordinary Jamaicans are far more wary of national debt than most electorates, thanks to their difficult history with it. Nonetheless, even if this is not easily generalised, this should still be an aspiration for other debt-addled economies. Fans of TLDR like you care about understanding the world around them. That's where today's sponsor Imprint comes into play. If you care about building a life of learning, then Imprint is the app for you. It's a new way to learn that turns your phone from an attention-sucking device to a tool for growth. You may have heard this before, but unless you've used the app, you likely haven't experienced something like this. That's because Imprint is beautifully illustrated and animated, creating a highly visual, bite-sized and interactive learning experience. It's the perfect antidote to a world where social media tries to keep us mindlessly dopamine scrolling day in and day out. Their library includes courses on topics like psychology, history, philosophy, finance, productivity, and many more, and quick reads you can consume in a single sitting. Since we last spoke to you about Imprint in September, I've done the philosophy course and am focusing on their course on the science of happiness. People study how to get in shape, how to eat right, and how to advance in their career. Understanding how humans are wired to be happy has been an interesting path to go down that I highly recommend to all of you. So make yourself feel better about your screen time, build a real habit of learning every day, and join the millions of people using Imprint. Plus, if you use the link in the description or scan the QR code on screen, the first 200 people will get 20% off an annual plan. Plus, they'll know that you came from us.